Mr Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just to go back to a couple of the strongest themes of this debate. First of all, the Conservative approach, which is to say this doesn't really affect Scotland. Why are we even discussing it? Well, the reason is, I think Monica Lennon put her finger on it when she talked about the underfunding of public services. If you have a piece of legislation coming through which will enable the suppression of wages in the rest of the UK, that has a direct consequence in Scotland, and it increases the pace at which the Tories have run down our public services in this country. That is why it's extremely relevant. And already, yes, I'll give way to Brian Whittle.
Brian Whittle.
Very grateful to Keith Brown for giving way. How on earth can you take this legislation and say that's going to suppress wage rises in the rest of the United Kingdom? That is absolutely fundamental nonsense.
Keith Brown.
I imagine Brian Whittle must be the only person in the chamber that can't see the link by restricting trade unions' ability to strike and the suppression of wages. But maybe if he goes away and researches a bit, he'll work it out. There has been a great deal of talk over many years, of course, about legislation surrounding trade unions in the UK, more often than not caused by the UK government over the day bringing forward legislation or failing to repeal legislation which actively seeks to curtail the effectiveness of trade unions, as is also the case with this piece of legislation. I speak as somebody who was a trade union member for many years, a branch officer in Shop Steward, who went on strike during the Thatcher years, but against a Labour employer, I should say, at that time in 1989. And I think it's very important to recognise, and I don't want to look necessarily for points of difference between ourselves and the Labour Party, but it is important to explain, I think, why Claire Hawley is not filled with trust from the Labour Party. It was the Labour Party, as I said, that we had to campaign against and strike against in 1989. It was the Labour Party that made huge commitments initially in the 90s to repeal the Tory legislation, some very far-reaching Tory legislation, and in many cases failed to do that, which again has led to that loss in support. And I think many of us have dealt with Labour employers over the years. I remember being threatened by an ex-member of this chamber for my trade union activities, threatened with legal action because of my trade union activities. I remember my own trade union, Unison, encouraging Labour members to spy on SNP councillors and click back to a certain area. So there is a long history of lack of... I'm not so sure what's bothering Brian. I don't know if Brian Whittle knows which debate he's actually in, but so there is a long history of distrust, and I think there is some merit in trying to overcome that distrust. Now, it was asked earlier on by Michael Marrow whether it should be the case that the SNP should support Labour's stated intention. I was asked repeatedly in 2014-2015 to not proceed with the biggest contract which the Scottish Government lets, which is the ScotRail contract, because Labour would be on their second and they would sort it all out so we didn't have to do it. That was 8 years ago. We still don't have a Labour government. And nobody believes, given Keir Starmer's track record, they will actually stay true to what they're saying just now. All of that means, I think, that the trade unions who we currently have are in a very difficult situation. They have been now for some years. But it's also true to say that if you look at the actions of the Scottish Government, that is the way to deal with trade unions. Get into a discussion, have the discussion where it's possible to do so, to compromise, but crucially recognise the role of trade unions and how they can help in terms of providing public services. I should also say that strongly trade unions are probably needed more now than they have been for many years, because it's pretty obvious to any working person in Scotland or the UK just how much poorer their paying conditions are now compared to just a few years ago. We know that wages have been largely stagnant in the UK for the past 15 years, while the cost of living has soared beyond all belief. According to the Resolution Foundation, an independent think tank focusing on the living standards of low to middle income workers in the UK, the average UK household is now £11,000 worse off in real terms than it was in 2008. But when we look to comparable countries like France and Germany, we can see the typical French household is 11% richer, or typical German household 27% richer than the typical family in the UK, again according to the Resolution Foundation. And on this, I'm happy to apportion the blame where it deserves to be, which is, of course, the 14 years of failed austerity that we've had from the Conservative parties. But most European countries, including France and Germany, have a far better, more collegiate approach to trade unions than the UK does. And that's reflected in the increasingly worsening living standards in the UK. The Tories are responsible for the biggest fall in living standards in living memory. That's an appalling record for them to preside over. The UK, it's my view that precisely because of the continual strengthening of anti-trade union legislation, why are they focusing on that? Why do they always focus on taking away people's rights? whether it's trans people, whether it's refugees, or in this case, whether it's trade union workers? Why are they always pandering to their base? And I mean the word base in both its senses. Their base in trying to attack people and indulging in culture wars. The latest one, this proposal, the Strikes Minimum Services Level Act, is just the latest in a line of anti-trade union legislation because they think it appeals to their base supporters. Just to remind the Chamber that Scotland has not voted for the Conservative Party or any of the earlier iterations of it since 1955. And in this coming election, which has been mentioned already, Scotland will actually have less representatives in Westminster than it does now, down to 57 from 59, whilst England, of course, will have 10 more. And that means that as a country, we are even less able to stop legislation like this. And the Labour Party has to wrestle. Daniel Johnson said that we should indulge in some self-analysis and reflection. If Labour were to get in next year, if they repeal that, two big ifs, what is to stop in 2 or 3 years' time after that going back to the same base Tory party that gets in once again, the usual ding-dong of UK politics, and workers again in Scotland having to pay the price for being part of the union? That's what we're trying to avoid here. And it's just about the very last nail in the coffin that we have in terms of the UK's conduct of our affairs. And just to say that the statements by Keir Starmer in relation to Margaret Thatcher, this admiration for Margaret Thatcher that he has, one thing that worries me is the fact that we passed in this chamber the Miners' Pardon Bill. And at that point was various commitments made by the Labour Party to say if they ever formed a government, they would go further. They would provide that pardon across the UK, and they would look at compensation for those miners, given the fact the UK government took over £4 billion from miners' pension funds. I really doubt whether Keir Starmer would even look at increasing the protections or the compensation for miners. And that's why I think it's very important that we support the motion today, because in the absence of the powers necessary to change the law, we have to be absolutely clear our opposition as a Parliament to this Act. And we can show what we would do differently if the powers over employment law were held here in this chamber. So for that reason, Presiding Officer, I support the motion in the name of Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr Brown.